The Syrian civil war is one of the most notable current disasters, as it has garnered international media outlets and was a topic of debate in the United States' recent presidential election. The creation of hundreds of thousands of refugees and indiscriminate bombing by Syrian troops have created widespread concern over the clear disregard for human rights by government forces. Rising tensions caused by political and economic stratification created a powder keg in Syria. As the gap between the wealthy elite and poor populations widened, conflicts began. This created an unstable political climate that allowed for the rise of authoritarianism, violence, and the rise of extremist factions. Under President Hafez al-Assad, Syria operated using outdated and dangerous agricultural and environmental policies. Resources were abused, leaving Syria land vulnerable to disaster. After a devastating drought in 2006, Syria's agricultural industry was left in ruins, which stretched already weak economic capacities. Propaganda used by Assad increased fear and tension between the Sunni majority and the Alawite minorities. Following a popular anti-authoritarian movement in other Arab nations, Syrian citizens began to protest the oppressive policies of the Assad regime. The previously mentioned powder keg was sparked by the arrests and torture of children who created anti-regime graffiti. What was initially peaceful demonstration escalated to full-blown war following the use of ground troops and airstrikes by Syrian forces. This war still wages on today. There are several wars within the Syrian civil war involving other countries and diverse stakeholders. As shown by this infographic, there are multiple conflicts happening within the Syrian civil war. This has created a delicate situation for humanitarian aid agencies. Additionally, this has strained diplomatic efforts and made mitigation largely unsuccessful. This map further explains the difficult situation in Syria by highlighting the different forces in action in Syria and the geographic implications of so many opposing forces in the same area. Conflict began in March of 2011 when a group of school students were arrested for anti-Assad graffiti, which sparked nonviolent protests and awareness campaigns inspired by the recent Arab Spring movements. Throughout the year, tensions escalated, and in July, a sect of the Syrian army opposed to killing unarmed protesters defected, leading the Assad government to withdraw from areas under the control of the Free Syrian Army Group. Multiple countries imposed sanctions. Violent conflict escalated throughout 2012. There were large terrorist attacks in Aleppo and Damascus in March. Sexual violence is described against men, women, and children by Syrian government authorities. In August, the UN, WFP, and FAO conducted joint rapid food needs assessment that finds almost 3 million Syrians in need of food. At the end of the year, the UN and EU give 60 million in humanitarian assistance. The EU gives another 21 million euros for refugees in Lebanon and Jordan. The WFP releases their expanded region response plan. In January of 2013, the UN estimates that there are 2 million internally displaced persons, 650,000 refugees, and 70,000 deaths. In June, the UN launches a 4.4 billion humanitarian appeal, the largest ever. In August, the Syrian government uses chemical weapons against rebel head Damascus. OCHA states that there has been no progress in gaining cross-line access into hard-to-reach areas and no improvement in the protection of civilians. The EU, OCHA, WFP, and UNICEF call upon the international community to increase funding for humanitarian aid, calling the Syrian situation the greatest humanitarian tragedy of our time. In February of 2014, UNICEF launches a $2.2 billion appeal to aid nearly 60 million children. In June, UNHCR reports no progress in implementing border aid operations, allowing access to besieged or hard-to-reach areas, observing medical neutrality, ceasing aerial bombardments, or easing administrative hurdles. U.S. and coalition-led airstrikes on ISIL-held areas take place in August, and by March of 2015, OCHA estimates there to be 3.9 million refugees. Throughout the beginning of 2016, violence escalates in Aleppo. The UN begins airdrops of food and medicine in June. Multiple political leaders call for pauses in fighting to allow for aid. The UN unanimously endorses a ceasefire. Presently, violence continues. The most recent death toll is well above 250,000, and the UN announced in January that it is no longer updating the Syrian death toll because it cannot reliably track those killed by the conflict. There is no solid number of deaths caused by the conflict so far. Most estimates are at least 2 years old. At least one half of the refugees are children, meaning there is at least 2.4 million children seeking out safety in other countries. School is no longer continuing for most civilians. Many also have no access to hospitals or any healthcare services. An estimated 4 million Syrian children are not in school. This will have a dramatic impact on Syria's ability to maintain and cultivate human capital in the future, a crucial facet of the rebuilding process. The loss has not only been in human lives and money. Syria is also losing heritage sites. All of the most UNESCO's World Heritage Sites and other historical places in Syria have been destroyed. The Palmyra is one example. It was an ancient Semitic city that has now had damage inflicted upon it from ISIS. Aleppo was a historical city and a modern-day commercial center, but now lays in ruins due to the Syrian civil war. Extremist groups have taken advantage of the chaos in Syria to begin trying to gain footing there as controlling parties. The World Bank has estimated that in 2014 there was $70 to $80 billion worth of damage to Syria's capital stock. But once again, these numbers have not been updated recently. Also, World Vision and Frontier Economics says Syria lost out on $285 billion in growth opportunities since the war has started, and the conflict will reach $1.3 trillion in cost by 2020. Since 2011, nearly every component, consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports of Syria's GDP has decreased. A recovery in exports is not expected until the year 2020. There's a 60% unemployment rate, an extremely volatile inflation rate, and a fall in government revenues due to the collapse of oil and tax revenue. There's also been a depreciation of the Syrian pound. Oil output has dropped significantly over the last 6 years, given that ISIS has garnered control over the majority of Syrian oil fields. Oil accounted for 50% of exports and 30% of government revenue in 2010.